Financial Limited from 2002 until May 2012, and Senior Independent Director from 2008. Andrew is a member of the Advisory Board to the Board of Trustees of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. He was a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology from 2004 to 2007 and served as Vice Chairman Technology for the United States National Petroleum Council's report, Facing Hard Truths About Energy. Andrew received his degree from the University of Wales and qualified as a chartered accountant. He holds an honorary doctorate in engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and is an honorary fellow of Cardiff University. So, ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Gould.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for their invitation to speak at this conference. My subject is unconventional gas and oil frontiers worldwide and the role of LNG. And it's my intention to concentrate the bulk of my remarks on natural gas, as this is undoubtedly the area in which the most change will occur, probably with coal. I will attempt to put some data in front of you and then point to some of the uncertainties that makes the accurate forecasting of natural gas trends, particularly for supply and price, a difficult task. If there's unanimity on the role natural gas will play in the energy mix going forward, how we supply the growth reliably at a reasonable price for both consumers and suppliers still contains many unknowns. Let me deal with some of the fundamental differences between oil and gas markets. Oil is a totally fungible commodity with an extensive and well-built-out infrastructure. Once it leaves the wellhead and goes into a distribution system, it can go virtually anywhere in the world. Its destination will be governed by the cost of transport and the receiving party's refining requirements. There are a few exceptions to this. One of the most remarkable currently is the differential that exists between West Texas Intermediate crude, the US benchmark, and Brent. The reasons are twofold. Firstly, the rapid increase in domestic land-based production in the last 3 years has outgrown the existing infrastructure. And secondly, crude cannot be exported from the USA, thus limiting its distribution. The infrastructure problem will be solved. Whether the US government will authorize crude oil exports is another matter. Natural gas is different. The economics of bringing gas to market are different in function of the method that gas is transported to market. Pipe gas has a single destination or is put into a distribution system that will have limited points of sale. It cannot be readily diverted from different markets as oil can. The only way to do this is through liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The process requires a heavy investment in midstream infrastructure to liquefy, transport, and regas on arrival. In a typical LNG project, the midstream investment will be roughly 2/3 of the capital, with only 1/3 going to the upstream extraction of the gas, whereas in oil, 2/3 would be in the upstream. The cost has meant that LNG players need to find markets in advance of launching new projects, something which rarely or never occurs in oil. Let me start by pointing out some of the obvious facts about gas. All the forecasting agencies agree that gas will show the highest demand growth of all fossil fuels in the next decades. Geology, megatrends, the advent of economic unconventionals in the form of shale and tight gas all point to a greater potential source of supply. The corporate challenge resides in assessing gas market prospects and policy uncertainties, their effect on pricing dynamics and developing infrastructure for transportation and the delivery of gas to market. Shale gas as a principal new source of supply is unproven outside the United States, and long lead times, increasing costs and delays are likely. Reserves and traditional high-value markets are necessary to support project development. These uncertainties provide many challenges for both producers and consumers. Gas is subject to competition with other fuel sources at many levels. Its position in the energy chain and the various factors influencing its competitive position are many. At the cost level, its principal competition is with coal, both in comparison with coal and renewable energy sources. The cost of emissions, be it in the form of a traded credit or a tax, or carbon capture and storage, have to be taken into account. Gas often serves as a balancing fuel in periods of peak demand for power generation, and as a result can be subject to wide fluctuations in price. This is equally true for the northern winters as it is for the air conditioning months, for example, in the Middle East. Gas has been, and to an extent will remain, the fuel of choice for replacing nuclear generating capacity as public opinion and political concerns over safety and environmental damage continue to erode the world's nuclear park. This will be exacerbated as the nuclear park continues to age. Finally, moving gas to market is still a relatively incomplete chain compared, for example, to oil, as I previously pointed out. Natural gas is not without its own environmental concerns for both conventional and unconventional sources of supply. The flaring of associated gas in oil production remains an issue in many places and becomes increasingly complex as oil production moves offshore into deeper waters. It's also a major concern in the production of wet gas from shales. Over time, the limitation of flaring of associated gas has generally been slow as efforts to limit it in one part of the world have tended to be negated by increases in other places. We're all familiar with the controversy over the use of hydraulic fracturing in the exploitation of shale gas and the concerns, both real and imagined, that it gives rise to. Equally, fears over contamination of freshwater aquifers by both fracturing fluids and gas have to be addressed. And finally, control over the methane emissions during the production process are necessary if gas is to maintain its position as a less intensive fuel from an emissions standpoint. These debates outside the USA are coupled with concern over land usage and the footprint that shale gas requires in the drilling stage. Huge quantities of water, sand, and proppant mean that the actual footprint of shale gas wells is very large while drilling, but very small during production. Perhaps one of the most interesting controversies around gas at the moment is the consequence that the advent of cheap gas in the USA has had on energy markets in Europe. The switch to gas in power generation in the USA has led to large exports of thermal coal from the USA to Europe. As a result, coal has been the fastest growing power generation fuel in Europe, with the unintended consequence that while emissions have declined in the USA due to the switch to gas, they have increased in Europe despite Europe's emission trading system and the ambitious goals for emissions reduction. The situation is at its worst in Germany, where in addition, nuclear power is in the process of being abandoned. In the US Energy Information Administration's 2013 reference case, natural gas is the world's fastest growing fossil fuel, with consumption increasing from 113 trillion cubic feet in 2010 to 185 trillion cubic feet in 2040. Growth in consumption occurs in every region in the outlook and is most concentrated in the non-OECD countries, where demand increases more than twice as fast as in the OECD countries. Please note that this graph of regional consumption shows growth to 2025 and not 2040. Growth in natural gas consumption is particularly strong in the non-OECD countries, where economic growth leads to increased demand over the projection period. Consumption in non-OECD countries grows by an average of 2.2% a year through 2040, more than twice as fast as the 1% annual growth rate for natural gas demand in the OECD. As a result, the non-OECD countries account for 72% of the total world increment in natural gas consumption, and the non-OECD share of world natural gas use increases from 51% in 2010 to 59% in 2040. Abundant natural gas resources and robust production contribute to the strong competitive position of natural gas among other energy sources. In the EIA reference case, the largest production increases from 2010 to 2040 occur in non-OECD Europe and Eurasia, 18.9 trillion cubic feet, and the OECD Americas and the Middle East. The United States and Russia each increased natural gas production by around 12 trillion cubic feet, together accounting for nearly 1/3 of the total increase in world gas production. Russia's production growth is supported primarily by increasing exploitation of resources in the country's Arctic and eastern regions. The US production mainly comes from shale resources. The reference case projects a substantial increase in those supplies, especially in the United States and also in Canada and China. In the United States, one of the keys to increasing natural gas production has been advances in the application of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing technologies, which had made it possible to develop the country's vast shale gas resources, have contributed to a near doubling of the estimates of total U.S. technically recoverable natural gas resources over the past decade. In the reference case, shale gas accounts for 50% of U.S. natural gas production in 2040. Tight gas, shale gas, and coal bed methane resources in Canada and China account for more than 80% of the total domestic production in 2040 in the reference case. In the 2025 timeframe, I'd like to try and illustrate what I consider to be the biggest unknowns in these projections. And this is the capacity of the industry to develop sufficient new projects to fulfill the demand requirement in the time available. For me, there are three key variables in this. Firstly, the ability of the industry to complete on time greenfield projects in various locations around the world. Secondly, the ability of the industry to successfully exploit shale gas resources beyond the USA and Canada. And thirdly, the evolution of the LNG industry, both in terms of capacity and cost. The role of US gas exports will be fundamental in this. Let's take a more simplistic view of the problem. This graph splits the next 12 years into a global field decline number, a volume from known new projects, and additional new projects that would be required to meet the 2025 demand predictions. Effectively, this shows that the gas production, taking into account field decline, would have to double in size by 2025 compared to today to meet the requirement. We should now look at the components of the developments that will be necessary. This graph shows the split between conventional and unconventional resources, as well as between the Americas and Europe and Russia, Africa, and Asia. The first comment would be that the story of the Americas is unconventional, both in Canada and the USA, and to a lesser extent in South America. I'll come back to this in a minute, but first let's look at Russia, Africa, and Asia story a little more closely. In Asia, the unconventional portion is largely due to Australia and China. In Australia, this would cover both shale and coal seam methane, and in China, a major increase in shale gas production, as was pointed out by the EIA in their reference case. Australia's development projects have been plagued with cost overruns due to both inflation and exchange rate fluctuations. They have all been subject to delays, and it is probable that further developments will be highly dependent on LNG pricing and a moderation of the domestic costs of development. One industry player has suggested that Australian costs are as much as 40% higher than the United States. In Africa, new resources have been found in both West Africa, where some infrastructure exists, but also in East Africa, notably in Mozambique and Tanzania, where the basic infrastructure of offshore gas development, liquefaction, and transport will be entirely new. The cost will be high, as a lot of upfront investment will be necessary to build the projects. The political and social infrastructure to support this scale of development is still in its infancy. The timing of LNG from East Africa will be subject to considerable doubt for some time to come. North Africa should remain a key supplier of gas, but political stability will be essential to attract the necessary investment. In Russia, future supplies will depend greatly on onshore developments, particularly in the Yamal Peninsula. Some signs that the market is growing more flexible have been observed, with players other than Gazprom being allowed to undertake gas developments and protect LNG exports. Pipeline capacity to Europe has vastly improved, and increasingly talks of exports to the Far East are being raised. If we turn now to Europe and the Americas, it is here that we see the full force of the success of the USA with unconventionals. If this has been a success in the USA, it's important to understand the differences between the exportation of shale gas in the US and elsewhere in the world. This map shows the geographical distribution of shale oil and the shale gas resource around the world, demonstrating that potentially many other places have as larger opportunities as the USA. The table that I will show following has estimates of the technically recoverable resources for various countries around the world. It also contains estimates for recoverable shale oil resources, which, while they are important in this context as the methods of extraction and therefore the requirements in terms of equipment and infrastructure, are very similar. It is here that I'm doubtful that the success of the USA can be easily replicated in other places. This projection from the EIA shows clearly how essential shale gas is to future supplies. It only covers the contributions of the USA, China, and Canada. And while I would not contest the contribution of the USA and Canada, the projection for China gives me serious cause for concern, as would the projections for Europe, Australia, and most of South America. To understand my concern, it's necessary to look at the unique set of circumstances that has made shale such a success in the USA, and to consider to what extent they exist elsewhere in the world. The first difference from almost every other country in the world concerns land and mineral rights ownership. The landowner in the USA will experience financial gain through his mineral rights should somebody wish to exploit them for shale gas or shale oil. The second consideration for land is a question of space. While shale is exploited in population-dense areas in the USA, there is generally a lot more room. The type of activity that built up in the Barnett Shale in Texas would be unimaginable in the UK or Germany. The nuisance factor from having a rig and frac fleet in your backyard is not compensated by any rent from the activity as it is in the USA. The third difference is the massive availability of existing data in the USA. Most areas where shale exists have been drilled for conventional oil and gas. As a result, much seismic and well-logged data already exists, giving operators a much clearer picture of where prospective shale is located. Outside the USA, in most places, such data is sparse, meaning that operators have to undertake a phase which approximates to conventional exploration. The next difference, which is possibly the most important, is the size, quality, and efficiency of the oilfield service industry in the USA. By sheer number of rigs, it is impressive. In the USA, between 2000 and 2007, the number of rigs operating on land averaged 1,240, while in the shale boom from 2008 to 2012, they averaged 1,660. In Europe, excluding Russia, the current land rig count is about 129. You can extend this parallel to all the other necessary equipment, particularly fracturing fleets, trucking capacity for sand, water, and proppant. Europe and many other parts of the world do not have scale. The scale of operations required to support shale gas development makes the availability of equipment and logistics critical to the cost of exploitation. Again, the size of US operations lends itself to economies of scale that allow service companies to operate at much lower prices and still make good returns. For example, a frac fleet in the USA might average as many 30 fracs a month, while in Europe it will be lucky to do 2. Lastly, the USA is already equipped with a vast network of pipelines for gas distribution, and while in many places the advent of shale gas has meant in reversing the direction of flow, the basic infrastructure is there. This is not the case in many other parts of the world. All this doesn't mean that shale cannot be exploited in other parts of the world. It means that the economics for operators are likely to be completely different, and the appetite for risk will be lower. The upfront investment in equipment and infrastructure will be much larger, and as a result, the gas price necessary to make a proper return will be completely different from that of the USA. And this leads me to my last subject, which is the role of LNG in the gas supply equation. The USA is by far the lower-cost producer of new gas supply. However, this needs to be seen in the context of the fact that the USA is largely, with the exception of Canada and Mexico, a closed market. The cost of shale gas landed in Asia is currently an extremely attractive proposition for Asian buyers when linked to contracts on Henry Hub US pricing, and their efforts to obtain these are relentless. Of course, in the longer term, it's difficult or nigh impossible to estimate how much gas the USA will permit for non-free trade country export, and what will be the ultimate increase in domestic demand at various price levels. And this is probably the biggest unknown hanging over the future of LNG developments. The graph makes the point, although in my view, it seriously underestimates the cost of both China shale and China coal bed methane. This graph shows the recoverable amounts of gas at different prices from North American unconventionals, and it shows that it is more than adequate for the needs of both current domestic demand and known export volumes. However, several questions remain which will influence not only the price at which US gas is exported, but also the decisions that are made on subsequent LNG developments in other parts of the world. After a period with no new approvals of non-free trade area export projects, the U.S. Department of Energy has recently approved Freeport Lng, Lake Charles Liquefaction, and Cove Point. These alone would put the USA currently in the position of being second largest exporter of LNG behind Qatar. And it should be pointed out that there are 13 projects still waiting in the list, and it would not take all of these to put the country in the Premier League of LNG exporters with Qatar and Australia. Of course, Department of Energy approval is not the final hurdle, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approval, which represents a possible cost for each project of roughly $100 million, is still to be obtained for all the projects except Cheniere's Sabine Pass. The workload on the FERC, as well as the engineering and execution of the projects themselves, represent a major commitment for the industry, and delays could well occur. However, as the potential for large U.S. export volumes grows, so the final investment decision on other expensive sources of new LNG supply will become more difficult. However big the U.S. export total becomes, it will not be sufficient to satisfy projected demand. The above graph layers new development of supply to 2025 on the existing supply of 2013. It can clearly be seen that the role of Western Canada, East Africa, and the USA become critical post-2020. However, in the case of the USA, we have just reviewed the obstacles remaining, and in the case of Canada and East Africa, no projects have yet taken a final investment decision. The probability that this new supply will arrive on time is low. Before I move to my conclusions, I would like to present you with some data made available by ExxonMobil recently. It illustrates clearly the scale of the problem the industry is facing. Exxon estimates that by 2025, 40 countries will be importing LNG, up from the current 27, that 600 million tons per annum in 2040, 75% Asia, up from a current, or 2012 total of 239. 840 million tons is currently under construction at a cost of $231 billion. And being Exxon, they point out that costs are currently rising faster than LNG prices. These are remarkable figures, and the sheer volume of work necessary is extraordinary. Price will be the final decider of the uncertainties I've aligned, and classic economic theory would have us believe that price will be fixed by the marginal cost of supply. This, as I've tried to demonstrate, is currently a difficult equation to resolve. If the marginal cost of supply is Henry Hub, then prices will fall, but falling prices will delay decisions on other new sources of supply. Project delays are likely to cause price fluctuations or changes in demand patterns. As LNG projects are long-term in nature, delays in taking final investment decisions on new projects will cause supply shortages to build up that cannot be quickly rectified. In the long term, Henry Hub reference price may not be in the consumer's best interests. The issue is further complicated by the number of countries where domestic gas prices are heavily subsidized. Subsidized gas prices encourage excessive consumption and add to many countries' fiscal deficits. However, a rapid transition to market pricing is often politically unacceptable and cannot be achieved in a short period of time. This graph clearly shows, in gray, the huge volume of gas which is administered at the domestic price below that of Henry Hub. Let me try to summarize the principal challenges. The dislocation between regional gas prices remains, and an eventual convergence will be driven by classic market forces, but this may take a long time to crystallize. And as a result, questions will arise as to how fast gas demand will grow relative to supply. The question of how much gas the US export will be fundamental to this. How quickly will Africa and Canada ramp up? One factor which is greatly ignored is the extent to which gas demand is growing in the Middle East, and that the Middle East cannot satisfy its own gas demand from its current production base. How much piped gas will reach China from Russia and the former Soviet republics? And will Russia be able to maintain a degree of indexation to oil prices for its European gas exports, or a price structure, which is a phrase I prefer, or necessary to invest? And where and how much shale gas resource will be developed outside the USA? Lost my conclusions now. So, while the outlook for gas demand is positive under almost any economic scenario, and we know there's plenty of resource, turning it into reserves and production is still fraught with many difficulties for both time and cost. The gas transportation system is still incomplete and immature, and it can lead to major price dislocations. And the pricing of natural gas will normalize to fundamental market rules, but only when the supply and delivery are a lot more developed and understood. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Andrew Gould. Any questions from yourselves? Plenty.
Yes, my name is Tassos Vlasopoulos. I'm from GE Oil and Gas. Let's pick up on the point around costs. A lot of statistics show that between 2005 and 2012, the capital costs in the oil and gas business has increased as a result of technical complexity and supply chain. In your position, from your extensive career, how do you think the OEMs, OFS, and oil companies, their relationships will evolve in the future to address these particular needs?
Well, I would add a third element to the cost inflation that the industry has experienced, and that is the fact that the operators are desperately short of qualified personnel. And as a result, very basic errors occur, and those basic errors add hugely to cost. I can remember one project where they ordered a 70 or an 80-ton crane, and they needed a 120-ton crane, so they ended up with 2 cranes, so they're paying for 2 cranes, right? So I think that, you know, I've had this argument with some of my customers when I was Schlumberger. They don't like it, but they know that in the end, yes, technical complexity is added to cost, the size of project is added to cost, and the incapacity of the industry to manage the project and the engineering load in the project is added to the cost. Now, I always thought that, you know, if you look at the aeronautic industry, you work for GE, right? So when Boeing designs a plane or Airbus designs a plane, they go to Rolls-Royce and GE and Pratt and Whitney and all the rest of them before they even start designing the plane and say, what sort of engines are you going to be able to produce in 7 years' time when this thing's going to fly? And it's the same in the automobile industry. In the automobile industry, you know, 80, 90% of the automobile is outsourced to competent subcontractors. The oil and gas industry hasn't gone that way yet. They don't know how to outsource parts of the project to people who are really competent to do it. And I think that if we want to get these projects back under control, they're going to have to go that way. Now, I understand that for reasons of license to operate, responsibility, you know, government relations, it's more difficult to do when you're doing an oil and gas project, or a mine for that matter, than when you're doing building an aircraft or an automobile. But if they want to reduce a much greater degree of efficiency into the system, they're going to have to use their supply chain much more intelligently.
Mr. Gould, thank you very much for the very nicely detailed topics and good analysis of the changes in natural gas business. You gave some attention to Russia in your presentation, and you mentioned that the markets are fragmented and they are not as standardized yet as oil markets. And if we could probably look at the breakdown, what could potentially change the gas markets to become more standardized, like in the oil markets? For example, could we have a look that developments in the shale gas in US was the first game changer, and the potential supply of Russian gas to China in increased volumes as a second game changer? And maybe you mentioned that Eastern Africa LNG is still yet got some time to be available, but Eastern Africa is a third game changer. Would these 3 game changers make a structural shift in the pricing in Asian gas markets, and will it bring the gas markets towards some standard pricing mechanisms eventually? And obviously it will all increase the price of gas in
My
Asia? Thank you.
my feeling is that the Henry Hub, because the US is a closed market, and today nothing is being exported, and therefore one of the reasons the price is artificially low is that current production in the US has nowhere to go. So, you know, Japanese buyers, Korean buyers, Chinese buyers, they would all like to have Henry Hub as the reference price. But in the long term, if you're talking about Russia building gas lines to Asia and, you know, developing Arctic gas and developing East Africa, then Henry Hub is not going to be the marginal price of new gas. And therefore, you know, my fear is that by forcing sellers to take Henry Hub as a reference, they're going to delay investment. And if they delay investment, they'll make the problem much worse in 5 to 10 years' time. Now, in Russia, if you want my opinion, you need to lower the cost of production. You really do. You know? And I think you can do it. But, you know, you have more gas than anyone else, possibly, but the cost of production is too high.
Paul Arwas, Heather Energy. Just wanted to ask you whether you felt that there was a real potential upside on gas demand through switching of automotive usage through to different forms of gas, either in the US or other parts of the world.
I think China will lead. China is already doing miniature LNG for trucking. I don't think that you're going to see the family automobile convert to gas necessarily, but long-range trucking and railways, LNG tankers are already being powered by their own gas. Shipping, yes, you're going to see a greater use of gas in transportation. You know, it's the same old issue of distribution, right? You know, getting it down to, you know, gas, getting it to a pressure which is manageable, and then getting it into a vehicle and having the stations necessary to fill those vehicles is another huge investment, which probably today would make the marginal cost of gas in the tank higher than gasoline.
Tom McCann from Simmons & Company. Just a quick question about gas to liquids. We've heard a lot this morning about technology not being picked up. We have an oil price that's over $100 a barrel and forecast to stay there. Gas prices that are low, and yet this technology seems to be left on the shelf almost. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think, we've had a technical breakthrough in gas to liquids that's yet made it a process that can be consistently economic. There's a gentleman from Shell here, I think he worked on the Pearl project. You might ask him about it. And also it's a question of scale. I think it probably only works at a very large scale. So, you know, I don't think you can assume that, in things like shale gas, feeding shale gas into a gas to liquids thing is necessarily going to be. I mean, the project that BG is doing in Queensland, it's not gas to liquids, but it's coal seam methane to LNG. For the same volume of gas to fill the trains that are filled by 3 wells on another project offshore, we're using 2,000 wells. It's a completely different business. So, you know, I think that gas to liquids is probably only valid today at a very large scale.
Hi, my name is Uka from UCL Energy Institute. From your point of view, opponents of the shale gas industry are of the opinion that the interaction with renewables, that there will be a decline in investment in renewables. What is your opinion?
Sorry, can you?
Opponents of shale gas production are of the view that the interaction with renewables, that there will be a decline in investments with renewables. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult to discuss renewables unless you discuss renewables in the context of subsidies. Because I don't think there's any doubt that almost anywhere today, even in Europe, that the cost of renewables without subsidies is not going to be able to compete with a local source of gas. And so the question is going to be, to me, the big question is 2016, when according to the European community, all the coal-fired power stations are going to shut down. It ain't going to happen. It's just not going to happen because there's no way that you can replace the generating capacity of coal in Europe, even in the UK, between now and 2016, even with gas. So, I don't think the question is yet between gas and renewables. It's far more between gas and coal, because if you do need to create a rapid source of power generation, probably a steam heat boiler powered by gas is the fastest way to do it. It's certainly not renewables.
Hey, hello, Mr. Gould. I'm Kelvin, an MBA graduate. Hi here.
Hi.
Okay, yeah, and now working in Potent & Partners. I would like to hear your view about Australian gas market right now, because I know BG has a lot of projects in Australia, but now their projects are suffering from cost overruns and severe delays. So what's your view on that? Because at the same time, we now discover another game changer, East African gas. They have very good cost advantage over Australian projects, and also the geographic proximity to Asia. So what's your view?
Well, I think that, so firstly, the BG cost blowout in Australia was $5 billion, and it was 80% the movement in the US dollar, Australian dollar exchange rate between the time we FID'd the project and the time we paid the bills, and 20% was scope overrun. And we don't anticipate any more cost blowout, and we're going to meet the deadlines that we said for first gas into the plant by the end of the year and first LNG by the middle of next year. Now, the issue in Australia has been a huge blowout in costs, which was driven by a concurrent cycle between the mining industry and the oil and gas industry. So all the trades in Australia, be it mechanics, electricians, fitters, riggers, all the rest of it, had an absolute field day with their salaries, which actually are already coming down. Last time I visited Queensland, I went to a guy who was welding. I said, "How long have you been here?" He said, 2 weeks. I said, "Where were you before?" He said, "On an iron mine in the Pilbara." So, labor, things are naturally adjusting. And there is also, I think, a very, very strong understanding, particularly from the new Australian government, that unless they do something about their cost structure, they're not going to be competitive. So you will have seen that Tony Abbott has made an election pledge to repeal the carbon tax, which I think he will do, and to repeal the mining tax. So I think Australia will remain competitive, provided it gets its cost base under control. And I am sorry, I think that the East African projects are going to take a lot longer than people think. You look at the current political situation in Mozambique, there are no institutions, there's no infrastructure, everything has to be done from scratch. It's not going to happen very quickly. There's plenty of gas, but it's not going to happen very quickly.
Thank you. Gareth Davis from the Highland Group. Just a quick question. You talked about in the USA, the differences in the utilization of the service companies, and then the cost structure, how different that was. I wondered if you could reflect on Europe and, especially offshore, and how that industry might become more cost efficient, more reliable, and also look at the codependence between the operators in the North Sea, if you had any views on that.
Well, it comes back a little bit to the question the gentleman asked about the ability of the service industry to cooperate with the operators. The degree of cooperation in the oil and gas industry is absolutely appalling. I mean, they're all partners, but they don't actually cooperate. So, to rationalize the North Sea infrastructure would be a very obvious thing to do, particularly in terms of pipelines, transit platforms, and all the rest of it. But whether or not you can ever get all the people around the table with a common agenda to actually do that, I think is highly unlikely. So I'm not particularly optimistic that we can make a lot of progress there. Now, there may be some people whose business is to aggregate tail-end assets and to put those things together, and they will do it better. But it means they're going to have to buy out a lot of the partnerships. I think the North Sea partnerships is probably, one of the worst examples of partnership in the oil and gas industry, because there are so many. If they're big projects offshore Nigeria or something, you have maybe 2 or 3 maximum. But in the North Sea, you can have up to 10 partners in the same block. It's extremely difficult to get people to cooperate.
Andrew, thank you for answering so many questions. May I take advantage of your presence here and ask you what you wish BG could learn from Schlumberger and what you wished Schlumberger had learnt from BG while you were there?
So I get asked this question all the time, not in the form of wish, but I get asked, what's the difference between working in Schlumberger and working in an operator like BG? So in Schlumberger, and I'm sure that people in the service industry here will recognize what I'm going to say, you get up in the morning and you say, do I have a product or service that I can sell to my customer? Then you say, do I have people who can actually deliver it effectively? And thirdly, am I going to make any money? So those are the sort of, it's very simple schematic. That's what you do every day. In the oil companies, you spend all your time worrying about risk. You worry about technical risk, economic risk, geological risk, political risk, but it's basically a risk business. And therefore, there's one fundamental element in the two scenarios which is looked at completely differently, and that is human resources. In Schlumberger, I reckon even as CEO, I would spend 40% of my time on human resources. In BG, I think, it's probably, I don't know how much time the management committee spend on it, but it's certainly not 40%. And therefore, it's just a completely different optic. Now, I think I'm a firm believer that corporations are only as good as the morale of their workforce. And therefore, I would say that, what BG could learn from Schlumberger would be that managing your workforce effectively can bring you huge advantages. And I would say that one of the great advantages of being Schlumberger is we never had a huge exposure. In other words, when I first went to Russia, I decided to risk $100 million, which was, it's quite a big sum of money for Schlumberger. It wasn't going to break the company. But I didn't need to own any real estate. I didn't need to talk to government. I didn't need to do anything. So Schlumberger does not have the same notion, and sometimes it probably should, of risk as the operators would have. But largely because they don't own real estate.
Thank you very much for your lovely presentation about LNG. My question going to be on an area that, according to what I saw, was less mentioned in your presentation, and it's West Africa. We can see that in the next 20 years there's quite a big demand for electricity in some of the markets there. On the other hand, in order to produce electricity in an efficient way, doing it from HF or from heavy oil, that doesn't help too much, so gas is going to be the solution. For markets that we do not see gas, the gas reservoirs develop at the moment, I would expect to see many LNG ports, and from some reason, from what we see on the ground, you don't see them develop too much in West Africa at the moment. So I just wonder, what's your view? What stopped the equation of having these new LNG ports import?
Familiar enough with the West African electricity market to know, but I would assume that today, it's probably, if they have domestic oil, like the Middle East, it is cheaper to burn domestic oil than as a part of the internal budget of the country, not as an economic proposition. It's cheaper to burn the oil they have than to pay for imports of LNG. Now, the Middle East, every summer the Middle East burns a huge amount of oil to air condition. And every country in the Middle East now, except Saudi Arabia, is currently either importing LNG or building LNG facilities, because with the current differential between oil and gas prices, the arbitrage of importing LNG and freeing up crude for export is pretty favorable.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the clarity of your answers, which we enjoyed so far. And my question is that, in your opinion, after this evolution of the shale gas, what will be the impact to the pipelines that are scheduled to be made, like the minor Trans-Adriatic pipeline of Statoil and BP, or the large, bigger South Stream from Russia? I mean, if the prices are expected to fall, as some estimators say, then could we have a situation where pipelines like this will be not viable economically? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think shale will affect that personally, because I mean, I'm prepared to bet, and I don't know, that shale gas in Europe will be just as expensive as pipe gas. So if shale gas is developed in Europe, it'll be as a security of supply issue, not as an economical alternative. You know, I think the sad thing about shale gas is that it is tributary to the existing electrical grid that we have placed in our countries, because it's a bit like mobile telephony. In other words, if you have a shale gas well in your village, why don't you just power the village with that shale gas? But you don't, you know, instead of putting gas down a line, generating electricity somewhere else and bringing it back again. So I actually think that, you know, there are countries where small local applications of shale gas are likely to be used for local power requirements, for example. I don't think it's going to happen in Europe, though, because the existing grid and infrastructure is so entrenched. But I would reassure the sellers of gas from large volumes into Europe, I don't think shale gas in Europe will ever bring down the price of imported gas.
Hi, Tia. You knew that there was going to be one question on renewable energy. In line with your report, Facing Hard Truths About Energy, what do you think renewable energy is not facing?
I don't think renewable energy is not facing anything. I mean, the number one conclusion in the Hard Truths About Energy was that energy conservation is the best way to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels. But energy conservation, as you know, is a very long business, because it's about CAFE standards, building standards. You know, it doesn't happen overnight. What worries me about the political attractiveness of renewables is that it is hiding major issues with the existing capacity to produce energy. And that's particularly true in Europe, and the UK, by the way. So, you know, I have nothing against renewables. I just think that they should not be used as something that, you know, is politically popular, expensive, and hiding a real problem. But, I mean, to go back to the hard truths about energy, we were absolutely clear. The best way to reduce dependence on fossil fuels is energy conservation.
Andrew, I'm Jeff Kazo on the Warwick Global Energy MBA. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think BG made an investment in Brazil. How is that coming along?
Well, BG initially took 30% of the 5 big pre-salt licenses before the exploration phase. So BG now owns roughly 20 to 25% of the 5 very large pre-salt developments that are occurring in Brazil. This is a development program that will take place over the next 8 years. It's one of those great stories where you find a big reservoir, it just goes on getting bigger. So, you know, currently Petrobras is the operator. We have a very large technical team in Brazil. It's an extremely good relationship. Petrobras is doing probably on the pre-salt, not on their whole business, but on the pre-salt, which is obviously the biggest source of new cash flow for Petrobras. It gets the priority, and therefore I would say that we're pretty happy with the way the project's going.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention and your questions. Thank you, Mr. Gould, for answering all the questions.